Thank you so much, Joel. Do you hear me okay?
Yes. Perfect.
Okay. Okay, thank you. And thank you everyone for indulging me and letting me present virtually. My name is Garima. The paper that I'll be presenting you today is, I've written that with two of my co-authors who couldn't be here today, Alim Beveridge and Nadia Haig. This paper has been what I want to say a collective labor of love. So many of you in this room have sort of contributed to the ideas and seen the paper evolve over time. Juana, Simon, Joel, and a lot of other conversations. So those of you who haven't seen me present yet, I'm very excited to share with you today. So, my slides not. Just give me 1 second. So just all of you in this room, all of us are sort of interested in this notion of impact. And, obviously all of us are interested in the notion of B Corps and B Labs. And, just taking a step back and thinking about just broadly, how does this phenomena of B Corp and impact situate itself in the entrepreneurship literature? So there's a stream of entrepreneurship literature that argues that actors can endogenously update their opportunities for change. And those are a lot of words, so let me break them out for you a little bit. So what does that mean? It means that to exploit and construct opportunities. So opportunity is just not a thing sitting out there. Entrepreneurs can actually go out and construct opportunities. Yeah, how do they do that? Entrepreneurs do that by sort of trying these actions and organizing their practices within their organizations and trying them out, learning from their mistakes, learning from their successes, coming back, revising their practices and updating what they think is the impact they're trying to achieve. So it's a sort of a very practice-based view of how we understand opportunities. And so sort of the key takeaway from this stream of work is this idea that opportunities can be constructed post-founding, long after the enterprise has been founded, and the practices for organizing is really the link in doing that. So what does that mean when we think about our context of B Corps and this notion of organizing for impact? I think that B Corps presents such a unique and interesting context because, a lot of scholars in sort of the social entrepreneurship community have said that, we've always sort of focused inward in explaining organizational practices, but practices do have this external effect of simulating well-beings beyond organizational boundaries. And then what makes the context even more rich, even more interesting is this idea that the notion of agency is just so salient. What that means is that this idea of seeking good, that you want a good, sort of continues to update the opportunity as B Corp leaders try and retry what's the best way to organize their enterprises. And even the basic notion of B Corp certification and recertification, the B Corp leaders are really choosing, to certify or to not certify, and hence they're choosing to change their practices for impact. So to understand how opportunities constructed for impact and updated for impact, B Corps provide a very rich context to answer that question. However, sort of the gap in the literature is that if you look at the social entrepreneurship literature in general, there are very few handful of studies who really talk about configuring practices for impact, and even lesser so when we think about updating their practices. How do firms reconfigure these opportunities for impact? So that's what we set out to do. We asked how do for-benefit enterprises, in our case being B Corps, really endogenously update their opportunity for impact. So how we did that, our sample really constituted, like several of you in the room, the B Impact Assessment Survey. We used what we're calling two waves of data. One wave was the assessment scores between 2008 and 11. So our final sample was over about 400 companies. The second sample was a set of companies that were assessed between 2011 and 13, again, coming up to be a final sample of about 346 companies after applying a lot of cleaning and finding the best way to create the sample. In addition, we looked at 159 enterprises that were across the two waves. So this is more of a longitudinal sample. So 159 sort of undertook certification, then they recertified in the second wave, or maybe it was their second and third certification, we don't know that, but there's a longitudinal 159 enterprises element to it. We, as many of you have already said, the BEAC impact assessment is a huge assessment questionnaire. We looked at about 22 questions. We conducted extensive analysis to come at the set of 22. In the paper, we describe how. In addition, because we were interested in how the B Corp leaders are updating their opportunity for impact, in other words, changing their practices. We also conducted 24 interviews with B Corp leaders, some of the fund managers who use B Corp assessment as a funding decision, and one B Lab staff member. We also used archival documents that are available on B Lab's website. So in terms of analysis, for a quantitative analysis, we conducted latent profile analysis. Why we did that? What we were looking for is sort of this notion of sustainability profiles. So the big impact assessment sort of lists down a set of practices, and each organization sort of chooses how to orchestrate their practices. So we thought that looking at individual practices will not help us answer our question. Hence, we decided to look at a profile of practices and whether that profile changes over time or not. What we did in order to do that is we compared what we calling repeaters and first timers within wave 2. So within that wave, some set of companies were repeaters, other set of companies were first timers, and we wanted to compare that. And just reminding you of what I described about the longitudinal analysis, we also looked at about 159 companies across the two waves that took certification more than one time. For our qualitative analysis, I don't have time to go into it, but sort of a basic question we asked of our data was, what are the mechanism underlying practice change? So what did we see? Just to show you quickly the latent class profiles, in wave 2, we see that the first timers, again, those firms that have taken the B impact assessment the first time, provide a 3-class solution. All that you have to understand here is that the entire set sort of clustered into 3 groups in the way they organize their practices. However, the repeaters were made of 2 groups. So from 3, they went to 2, which means sort of a takeaway here is that there's change in these clusters, which indicate that, okay, yes, our data shows us that practices are being changed, and most likely these people are shifting which cluster they belong to, what we're calling peer groups here. Going back to the longitudinal analysis across the 2 waves, again, we see for the wave 1, there's a profile plot with 2 clusters. Again, for wave 2, which is the companies repeating the assessment, there's also a profile plot for 2 clusters. But what we see here, if we look closely at the data, is that the odds ratio are changing, which means that the probability of being in a cluster changes. So even though the number of clusters remain the same, by doing an odds ratio analysis, we again sort of re-emphasize or find the take-home point that there is a shift in practices going on, and these people are shifting their peer groups. We also found that size and sectors influence which cluster these firms would be in. So in wave 1, one of the predictors of cluster membership was manufacturing sector, and we also heard that in our interviews. One of the B Corp leaders saying, we were certified in 2012. I've seen a number of companies in our industry being certified. We know that our certification may have pushed some of them. In wave 2, we saw that size makes a difference. Again, we heard in the interview, I think Kickstarter would look to Etsy because both are huge tech firms versus a small professional service firm. What they're really saying is that you look for companies who are similar than you. A product firm would not look to a services firm. What we're calling this notion of size and sector in the model that we're trying to build is social reference. So size and sector are predictors, and it's sort of simple to wrap your heads around because if you are same size, same sector, you likely face similar issues, social and environmental issues. So it's not a surprising thing that you sort of follow that same group of practices. However, we also heard in our interview that a lot of companies were pushing against this notion of size and sector and saying that, there are really no others in our industry who we compare ourselves to. So sort of the bar is too low if I look at our industry. So we did see sort of agency brewing up as we found evidence of size and sector predictors. So at this point, I'm going to start building our model of embedded agency in prosocial organizing, is what we call it. And I'm going to build it as I tell you the rest of the results. So what you see in sort of the dashed box out there is our empirical context, which is sort of the B impact assessment. What we're interested in explaining, which is the left box, is this notion of reconfiguration of practices that update opportunities for social impact. And that box is a little bit outside because, obviously for these enterprises do not have input, all of their practices as the input sort of going into the B impact assessment. But that's the idea, that sort of this notion, they come in with their existing set of practices. Now, what I just explained to you is this notion of social reference, so size and sector sort of influencing how these firms, after taking the assessment, are reconfiguring their practices. And I'm going to keep building this framework. So the second thing we heard and saw in our data is what we're calling the notion of category cues. Again, the most interesting part in all of the rest of the results is this sort of juxtaposition of embeddedness with agency, and I'm going to spell that out for you. So embeddedness and category cues is what I'm calling here. That simply means that the notion of going through the assessment sort of opened my eyes, and we realized we sucked in certain areas. So there is this set of practices that the category brings in with, and you're, as a B Corp leader, you're sort of playing in those boundaries and saying, okay, I suck in environment, or I suck in the social category, etc. However, in addition to that, B Labs also provides a lot of materials on their website to sort of say that, okay, these are 4 ways to improve your score, or the assessment report tells you how to improve. So B Lab, or this category of B Corps, is giving you the boundaries in which you sort of understand what to change. However, the agency, we found several instances of agency in our interviews where these leaders are uniquely defining their peers. So things like when I went to B Corp retreat, it brought people together. I started a conversation with the women next to me, and that's how I decided how I would change the practices. And then, the notion that there's a Beehive, which is a social media platform for B Corps. They could go on there, ask their questions. So they don't have to be limited to the category cues that B assessment report is providing them. They are exercising their agency in deciding which practices to change and how. So just in terms of keep building that framework, I told you about reference. The second piece of is this sort of this notion of category cues, or which practices to change. Again, the juxtaposition being embeddedness and agency. Then we found 2 other, what we're calling mechanisms explaining how practices are changed. One is affordability. What it means is that we kept hearing this notion of low-hanging fruit. Practices you change are those that are low-hanging fruit. Those are the practices that require little resources like time or money to change. They're basically things that you're already doing, but you can just formalize them by writing a report. So for example, one of the B Corp leaders said, after the first assessment, we tackled the easier question first. For example, governance items asked if we circulate policy amongst employee. Okay, that's easy, let's circulate a policy. So it's sort of this embedded notion, or drawing boundaries around what costs you the less, what costs you the least, and what requires the least resources, along the lines of what we often call sort of this fossilized best practices in management research, very much drawing boundaries. And we see that in our quantitative data too, that we explain in our paper, but not here. Sort of the agency is this notion of, saying that, okay, there is low-hanging fruit, or there is not a low-hanging fruit, but I'm still going to do it or not do it. So for example, this B Corp leader is saying that even though employee stock options cost more, it is not a low-hanging fruit, but we decided to do it because I saw it as one of my goals since the start. And the assessment really reminded us of this goal. Again, sort of the most interesting piece of it for us is this juxtaposition of embeddedness and agency. Finally, this notion of interpretability, So there are certain set of practices in the assessment that are very concrete. There is very little room for differences across organizations, sort of like, do you have a mission statement? So, you can't interpret that in too many ways. However, the agency came in certain set of practices that had a latitude for interpretation. So, practices that used words such as significant supplier, charitable contribution, renewables, those could be interpreted differently by different enterprises. And again, this was in no way an act of deception, and I think B-Lab has very strong ways to understand whether the practice is really changing or not. Sort of our mechanism that we want to explain here is that because there is an opportunity for interpretation, it sort of brings in new ideas around how to change the practices. So one of the the B Corp leaders is telling all of our clients are nonprofit, and hence questions in the assessment such as charitable donations do not make sense. We had to really explain to B-Lab and engage in this conversation. The contribution for us means something different, and he goes on to explain how that really influenced the way they understood their practices within the organization, and over time decided to tweak them. Going back to our framework, the last box that I want to include in there is this nature of practices, this notion of interpretability and affordability. And through sort of this laying out this framework, what we're really explaining as we go back is this endogenous updating of opportunity for social impact in sort of reconfiguring your practices. So where does that leave us? It leaves us in terms of we make two main contributions, sort of going back to what I opened with in terms of where the literature is. We're bringing focus back onto practices and saying, hey, we really need to understand these practices if we want to understand impact and opportunity for impact. So existing literature, as I said, really describes how practices are organized. It really very little talks about how they're changed. And, we sort of our studies provided this insights on how opportunities are, continuously updated because of this notion of assessment and because of participating in this category of B Corp. We also provide two very unique mechanisms of prosocial agency in the framework that I laid out for you. So this notion that prosocial agency is embedded in this category of B Corps, but it sort of emerges or sort of comes through when they go through this practice of recertification and thinking, okay, how am I going to change my practices, and juxtaposing what the assessment presents to them and what they want to do. And, the notion that they're positioning themselves in this B Corp category, but only partially by making that we're laying out is this notion of social reference category Q and 2 nature of practices. Thank you.